It was a calm, ordinary day high above the clouds, where Flight 926 cruised smoothly toward its destination. Passengers sipped their coffee, laughed with loved ones, and flipped through magazines, blissfully unaware of the invisible danger waiting just minutes ahead. In the cockpit, Captain Eric Wallace, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, was at the controls, his steady hands guiding the aircraft. Beside him, First Officer Sarah Cole monitored the instruments, chatting lightly about their next stop in Denver. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. Without warning, alarms blared in the cockpit, cutting through the calm like a knife. Red lights illuminated the control panel as both pilots leaned forward, their professionalism overriding any panic. Eric's voice tightened. "Hydraulics failure. We've lost rudder control." Sarah's eyes darted across the displays, confirming his assessment. "It's not responding. The system's gone." At that moment, everything changed. The massive plane, carrying 184 souls, became a fragile object, barely holding itself together against the forces of gravity and air pressure. The loss of hydraulics meant they could no longer steer the aircraft properly. Every second counted. Eric's mind raced as he assessed their options, weighing every possible outcome. There were no guarantees, only choices. And one of those choices could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. Inside the cabin, the passengers felt the first jolt. The aircraft's smooth ride turned turbulent, shaking violently as though it had hit an invisible wall. Gasps filled the air. A mother clutched her child tightly, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. A businessman glanced nervously out the window, his laptop sliding off his tray table. The flight attendants hurried to calm everyone, but the fear was contagious. It spread like wildfire. "What's happening?" a voice asked, trembling. No one had answers, not yet. Back in the cockpit, Eric's focus was laser-sharp. He knew they had minutes, maybe less, to act. Denver was too far. They couldn't make it to another airport. Options dwindled as the plane's descent grew more rapid. Then, Eric saw it, a sprawling, open field west of the mountain range. It was their only chance. He turned to Sarah. "We're taking it down there." She nodded without hesitation. There was no room for doubt. The decision was made. "Mayday, mayday," Eric called over the radio, his voice calm but firm. "This is Flight 926. We've lost hydraulics and are preparing for an emergency landing. Coordinates are being transmitted now." The response crackled back, urging them to stay steady. But Eric knew this was on him. All eyes on the ground, and in the air, were now on Flight 926. The plane continued its shaky descent, dropping lower and lower as the ground rushed toward them. In the cabin, the passengers were instructed to brace for impact. "Heads down, stay down!" the flight attendants shouted, demonstrating the emergency position. Tears streamed down faces. Prayers were whispered. Time slowed. Eric gripped the controls with both hands, feeling the resistance, the chaos in the plane's movements. The open field grew larger in the windshield. It was rough, uneven terrain, far from ideal. But it was their only shot. He adjusted the plane's angle, using every ounce of his skill and experience to keep it steady. "Hold on," he muttered under his breath. It wasn't just a command to the passengers. It was a plea to the plane itself. The first contact with the ground was brutal. The landing gear collapsed almost instantly as the aircraft skidded across the field, sending up clouds of dirt and debris. Screams filled the cabin as everyone was thrown forward, the safety belts straining against the force. The plane tilted dangerously to one side but miraculously stayed intact. After what felt like an eternity, it came to a grinding, screeching halt. For a moment there was silence, the kind of silence that follows something incomprehensible. Then, slowly, cries and voices broke through. People were alive. Against all odds, the majority of the passengers and crew had survived the crash landing. Eric and Sarah wasted no time. They worked together to ensure the evacuation went as smoothly as possible. The flight attendants opened the emergency exits, deploying slides as passengers scrambled to safety. Smoke began to seep into the cabin, a reminder that they weren't entirely out of danger yet. But one by one, the survivors slid down to the open field, their feet touching solid ground once more. As the last passenger exited, Eric stood at the cockpit door, looking back at the plane he fought to save. It was battered and broken, but it had done its job. He felt a wave of relief, and exhaustion, wash over him. Stepping off the aircraft, he joined the others, where cheers and tears greeted him. In the days that followed, Eric's actions would be hailed as heroic. Aviation experts would analyze the data, marveling at how he had managed to maneuver the plane with such precision under impossible circumstances. The passengers and crew would recount their harrowing ordeal, each story circling back to the man who had made the split-second decision that saved their lives. But for Eric, it wasn't about heroics. It was about doing the job he had trained for, the job he had sworn to do. And as he looked up at the sky that day, watching rescue helicopters arrive, he silently thanked the years of experience that had prepared him for this moment, and the courage that had seen him through. The cockpit was a flurry of activity. The blaring alarms, flashing lights, and the mounting pressure could have overwhelmed anyone, but Captain Eric Wallace was no ordinary pilot. His hands moved swiftly, his voice steady and commanding as he worked through the chaos. Every action was deliberate, every second measured against the odds of survival. Sarah Cole, his co-pilot, mirrored his focus, her fingers flying over the controls, trying desperately to regain some semblance of control over the aircraft. The hydraulic failure was catastrophic. Without it, they couldn't steer the plane effectively. They were essentially gliding, a massive steel bird with clipped wings. Eric knew the numbers: altitude, airspeed, descent rate. They painted a grim picture. Denver was out of the question. The plane simply wouldn't make it. "We need a landing spot," Eric said, his voice firm but calm. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any patch of land that could serve as their lifeline. It wasn't just about finding a place. It was about finding the right place. Somewhere flat, somewhere clear. Somewhere that could give 184 people a chance. Sarah pointed to the map, tracing her finger across the terrain below. "There's an open field here, west of the mountains. It's rough, but it's big enough." Eric glanced at her, his mind already calculating the risks. Rough terrain meant the landing gear could collapse. There was no telling how stable the ground was or what obstacles might be hidden beneath the surface. But the alternative was worse. He nodded. "We'll take it." The radio crackled to life as Eric issued the mayday call. His words were calm, but the urgency was unmistakable. "This is Flight 926. Hydraulics failure. Preparing for emergency landing. Coordinates transmitted." On the ground, air traffic controllers scrambled to respond, their voices tense as they relayed instructions and support. But up in the sky, Eric and Sarah were alone. It was their decision, their skill, that would determine the fate of everyone on board. Eric adjusted the controls, his hands firm but steady. The open field came into view, a patch of brown and green amidst the rugged landscape. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He took a deep breath, his focus narrowing to the task ahead. "Brace for impact," he said into the intercom. In the cabin, the flight attendants sprang into action, their voices clear and commanding despite the fear that hung thick in the air. Passengers assumed the brace position, clutching their knees, their heads bowed. Prayers, sobs, and murmurs filled the cabin as time seemed to stretch impossibly thin. The ground rushed up to meet them, faster than anyone was prepared for. Eric guided the plane with precision, angling it just right to minimize the impact. The first contact was jarring. The landing gear buckled, and the plane skidded across the uneven field, throwing up clouds of dirt and debris. Inside, the passengers were jolted violently, their cries mixing with the deafening sound of metal grinding against earth. But the plane held. Against all odds, it held. The engines roared in protest as the aircraft came to a shuddering halt. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the cabin erupted in a cacophony of relief and disbelief. They were alive. Somehow they had made it. Smoke began to fill the cabin, a bitter reminder that they were not entirely out of danger. The acrid smell stung the eyes and throats of the passengers as they hurriedly unbuckled their seat belts. Flight attendants, their professionalism unshaken despite the chaos, sprang into action. "Move quickly but stay calm," one shouted, directing passengers toward the emergency exits. The inflatable slides deployed with a hiss, their bright yellow forms a stark contrast to the darkening sky. Captain Eric Wallace remained in the cockpit for a moment, his hands still gripping the controls as if reluctant to let go. His mind replayed the landing, every decision, every maneuver. Relief mixed with the weight of what had just happened. But he didn't have time to dwell. Unbuckling his harness, he rose and stepped into the cabin, scanning the scene to ensure everyone was evacuating safely. The passengers moved as quickly as fear allowed. Mothers carried crying children, elderly passengers clung to the arms of strangers, and friends called out to one another in the confusion. Despite the panic, there was an undercurrent of gratitude, a shared realization that they were alive. The roar of the engines had been replaced by the distant sound of sirens, rescue teams already on their way. Eric's voice cut through the noise. "Keep moving! Stay low and get clear of the aircraft!" He guided passengers toward the exits, his presence a steadying force in the midst of the turmoil. First Officer Sarah Cole was at the rear, helping a passenger who had twisted their ankle during the landing. Her calm, determined demeanor reassured those around her. Outside, the open field stretched wide under the fading sunlight. Passengers stumbled onto the grass, many collapsing to their knees as the weight of what they'd survived hit them. Some hugged loved ones tightly, others simply stared at the damaged plane, its fuselage scorched but miraculously intact. Eric was the last to leave. He took one final look through the cabin, ensuring no one was left behind. The smoke was thicker now, curling up toward the ceiling, but the fire hadn't spread beyond the engines. Satisfied, he stepped onto the slide, landing with a thud on the rough ground below. A wave of emotion swept over him as he joined the survivors. He felt the weight of every decision he had made in those critical moments. There were no cheers for him, no declarations of heroism. Just the quiet, overwhelming relief of seeing so many lives saved. A passenger approached him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eric nodded, his own voice caught in his throat. In the distance, the sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of emergency responders. The field was soon flooded with paramedics, firefighters, and rescue crews, their efficiency bringing a sense of order to the chaos. Passengers were guided to safety, injuries were treated, and the wreckage was secured. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Eric stood quietly on the edge of the field. His uniform was smudged, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes remained sharp, watching as the last of the passengers were tended to. Beside him, Sarah joined, her presence a silent acknowledgement of what they had endured together. Either of them spoke for a moment. Then Sarah broke the silence. "We did it," she said softly. Eric exhaled deeply. "Yeah. We did." His gaze lingered on the plane, now surrounded by firefighters dousing the smoldering engines. "But it wasn't just us. Everyone played a part." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Still, not everyone could have done what you did, Eric. You saved them." He shook his head slightly, the weight of her words sinking in. "We saved them," he corrected. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, he allowed himself a rare moment of pride, not for being a hero, but for doing what he had trained his whole life to do. The investigation that followed was as intense as the events of the flight itself. Aviation experts, engineers, and investigators descended upon the crash site, meticulously analyzing every detail of the damaged aircraft. The black box was recovered within hours, its data offering crucial insights into the series of events that led to the hydraulic failure. Reporters swarmed the field, broadcasting images of the broken plane and recounting the incredible survival story of Flight 926. The world wanted answers, and the pressure to uncover them was immense. Captain Eric Wallace and First Officer Sarah Cole became central figures in the aftermath. The aviation community lauded them as heroes, but Eric's humility remained unwavering. During the initial debriefing, he recounted each decision with clarity and precision, his focus still on the passengers and crew he had fought so hard to protect. Sarah, too, shared her perspective, emphasizing the teamwork that had guided them through the crisis. They both agreed on one thing: without the calm cooperation of everyone on board, the outcome could have been far worse. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation revealed that a small but critical flaw in the aircraft's hydraulic system had gone unnoticed during routine maintenance checks. The failure was deemed a freak occurrence, a rare convergence of mechanical and situational factors. However, it sparked urgent conversations about the need for more rigorous inspections and improvements to existing safety protocols. Airlines around the world took notice, implementing changes to ensure such an incident would never happen again. Meanwhile, the passengers of Flight 926 began to rebuild their lives. For many, the experience left deep emotional scars. Some sought therapy to cope with the trauma, while others found solace in reconnecting with loved ones. Stories of bravery and kindness emerged from that harrowing day: passengers who had helped strangers, flight attendants who had gone above and beyond to keep everyone calm. These small acts of humanity became the threads that bound them together, a reminder of the resilience they had all shown. Eric, too, faced his own reckoning. Though praised for his actions, he couldn't help but replay the landing in his mind, wondering if there was anything he could have done differently. The weight of responsibility lingered, heavy but bearable. He returned to flying after a brief leave, determined to continue doing the job he loved. Yet every time he stepped into the cockpit, the memory of Flight 926 remained with him, a silent reminder of what was at stake every time he took to the skies. Months later, a reunion was organized for the survivors of Flight 926. Held in a modest community center, it was an emotional gathering filled with hugs, tears, and laughter. Passengers and crew shared their stories, reliving the moments of fear and relief. Eric and Sarah were greeted like family, their presence a source of comfort to those who had looked to them for guidance during the crisis. One passenger, a young woman named Clara who had been traveling to visit her grandmother, stood to speak. Her voice wavered, but her words carried a profound weight. "That day could have been the worst day of our lives," she said. "But because of all of you, it became a story of survival, of courage, and of hope. We're here today because we didn't give up. And we owe so much of that to our crew, to Captain Wallace and First Officer Cole. Thank you for giving us a second chance." The room erupted in applause, but Eric's expression remained humble. He glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small nod, her eyes glistening. Together, they had faced the unimaginable and emerged on the other side. It wasn't about being heroes. It was about being human, about doing what needed to be done when it mattered most. As the night wore on, Eric found himself standing outside the community center, gazing up at the stars. The sky was clear, a vast expanse of possibility. He thought about the passengers, the crew, the decisions he had made in those critical moments. The field where they had landed was far behind him now, but its significance would never fade. It was a place where fear had been met with determination, where lives had been saved against all odds. "Ready to head back in?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her expression soft but knowing. Eric smiled faintly. "Yeah. Let's go." And with that they walked back inside, where life, in all its fragility and resilience, waited for them.